Good evening. There is a specific kind of quiet that settles over an authoritarian regime right before the floor drops out. It isn't the quiet of peace, and it certainly isn't the quiet of stability. It's the atmospheric pressure of a vacuum, the sound of a leadership that has spent 2 decades building a fortress of perceived invincibility, only to discover the walls are paper and the wind is rising. Tonight, we're looking at a disconnect. On one side, a podium in Moscow where the statistics gleam, the posture is upright, and the story is inevitable victory. On the other side, a reality in the mud of the Donbass, yes, the Donbass, as it's been misheard and misspelled in more than one corner of this war, where gains are measured in inches, costs are measured in 500,000 lives, and the great Russian bear is now reduced to begging North Korea for laborers and rummaging for old Soviet shells. The question tonight isn't only whether the war is being lost. The question is, when the lie grows this much bigger than the truth, who is actually left holding the keys to the kingdom? Look at this. Just look at the optics pouring out of the Kremlin's year-end press performance. It's December 2025. We are nearly 4 years into a special operation that was supposed to last 72 hours. And there he is, Vladimir Putin, seated in that gilded hall, telling a hand-picked audience of stenographers that the Russian economy is thriving, boasting a 1% growth rate, leaning into the microphone with the practiced calm of a man convinced he has outlasted the West's attention span. But this is the thing about autocracy. The leader's performance is only as strong as the audience's willingness to ignore their own empty cupboard. While the Kremlin broadcasts a message of military Keynesianism, this fantasy that you can fuel an entire national economy by building tanks and then blowing them up, the ground-level data reads like systemic organ failure. Because to understand where we are right now, you have to look at the numbers the Kremlin doesn't put on the teleprompter. We are tracking reports that the Russian central bank, first time in this entire conflict, has begun selling off physical gold from its reserves. Think about what that means. You don't sell the family silver because the farm is doing well. You sell the silver because the creditors are at the door and the harvest has turned to ash. And the historical parallels here aren't merely striking, they're screaming. In 1904, Tsar Nicholas II launched what his advisors called a short, victorious war against Japan. They believed a quick military triumph would stem domestic unrest, solidify the Romanov brand for another century, and prove Russian exceptionalism. They believed their own propaganda. Then the battlefield delivered reality, logistical incompetence, a technological gap, and the sheer hubris of an elite cutoff from the peasantry. That short, victorious war didn't save the Tsar. It helped ignite the 1905 revolution, the first crack in the dam that would later sweep the imperial order into history's dustbin. Fast forward to now, and we are watching a 2025 version of that same strategic blindness. The Kremlin points to an unemployment rate around 2%, the lowest in modern records, as if it's a miracle. But in a war of attrition, it's a flashing red light. It means there's no one left to work. It means the labor pool has been drained into trenches, hollowed out by mobilization, or has fled across borders to escape the draft. It is full employment of the graveyard. And then there is the human cost. Estimates now put Russian casualties killed or wounded, killed or severely maimed at over 790,000. That isn't just a statistic. That is a generational catastrophe. Nearly 800,000 families receiving wood memorials or payout slips instead of sons, husbands, and fathers. But here is the mini reveal that snaps the picture into focus. The Kremlin isn't only worried about the people who don't come home. They are becoming terrified of the ones who do. We are seeing a growing drumbeat of warnings, reports, analyses, and claims that the state is bracing for the destabilizing return of huge numbers of veterans, with some accounts putting the demobilization figure near 700,000 and framing it as a direct threat to regime stability. Because these are men promised glory and handed a meat grinder, men who watched staggering incompetence up close. Men returning to a country where the economic miracle doesn't buy bread. When an authoritarian leader can't reliably provide either guns or butter, he reaches for fear. But when the men who possess the guns no longer fear the man who claims to provide the butter, the arithmetic of power can change overnight. The monolith facade doesn't crack from one external blow. It fractures from slow, agonizing rot in the foundation itself. And as we move into our next segment, we're going to look at the mechanical failure of the Russian military machine, a failure that isn't only strategic, but structural. What happens when a corrupt, top-down system tries and fails to fight a modern, decentralized war? If segment 1 is about the psychological disconnect in the Kremlin, segment 2 is about the physical reality on the ground, the tangible breakdown of what was once marketed as the world's second most powerful military. For decades, Russian doctrine worshipped mass. Enough tanks, enough artillery, enough bodies, and you eventually overwhelm the opponent. Brutal, simplistic, but in 2025, that logic has slammed headfirst into a technological wall. Open source intelligence trackers like Oryx have documented visually confirmed Russian equipment losses on a scale that is frankly mind-boggling, more than 23,000 pieces of military hardware, with tank losses surpassing 4,000. To put it in perspective, that's more tanks than most NATO countries field in their entire inventories combined. But it's not only that Russia is losing equipment, it's how. Ukraine has turned this battlefield into one of the most transparent combat environments in human history. With unmanned aerial systems everywhere, drones, Russia can no longer mass forces the way it once did. The moment a column tries to assemble for a breakthrough, it gets spotted by something cheap, think a $500 drone, and then it gets bracketed and hit by precision fire within minutes. This has produced a strategic paralysis the Kremlin is desperate to hide. And so we see advances around places whose names keep appearing in dispatches and on maps. Pokrovsk and Kupiansk, even when they're misspelled as Pukhovsk and Kupansk, reduced to the smallest units that still look like movement on TV. We are watching gains measured in millimeters, literally. We are tracking an average rate of advance across recent months of 0.12 kilometers per day. At that pace, it would take years just to reach the next major city. This is what strategic failure can look like in the 21st century. Not a dramatic rout, but a creeping suicide leadership so committed to the idea of offensive that it is willing to trade 10,000 lives for a single bombed-out village. And why do they keep doing it? Because in an authoritarian system, loyalty is the only currency. If you're a Russian general who tells the truth that the offensive is impossible, that the troops are exhausted, that the new equipment is refurbished junk dragged out of the 1,960 seconds, you don't get rewarded. You get removed, you get resigned, you get investigated. We've watched this dynamic play out with commanders turned into symbols and scapegoats, figures like General Le Pen, fired and rehired, blamed and buried in the shadows, a game of musical chairs on a sinking ship. The Kremlin cannot admit the system is the problem, so the people must be the problem. But here is the deeper rot, and it may be even more dangerous for Putin than any single battle. The fortress economy is sliding into what analysts are calling a cannibal economy. To keep the war machine moving, the Kremlin is eating its own future, stripping funds from education, healthcare, and infrastructure to pump money into defense plants that are not innovating, but scavenging, refurbishing old T-62 seconds, pulling microchips from consumer goods, patching together a superpower's arsenal like a scrapyard project. And critically, it is leaning on outside suppliers. North Korea's role is no longer rumor. It has been repeatedly reported as a major source of artillery ammunition, with estimates in the millions of shells. When a self-described great power has to rely on Kim Jong-un to keep its guns firing, that is not strategic partnership. That is terminal dependence. The mini reveal here, the thing that should make everyone sit up, is what's happening to the economic lifeline that kept the regime afloat. Oil revenue. And the so-called shadow fleet of aging, often opaque tankers used to skirt sanctions. Ukraine has widened its campaign. In recent days, we've seen Ukraine claim strikes in the Caspian Sea. An oil rig hit hundreds of miles from Ukraine alongside a broader pattern of long-range maritime and energy-related attacks. Reuters, +1. We've also seen reporting on a Ukrainian drone strike against a Shadow Fleet-linked tanker in the Mediterranean, the first of its kind, showing just how far the map of this war is stretching. The Guardian, +1. The Kremlin thought it could keep the war over there in the Donbass borderlands. But the war is now reaching for the one thing that keeps the regime alive. If that Shadow Fleet gets neutralized, if oil flows choke, then the cannibal economy runs out of things to eat. And that brings us to the democracy versus authoritarianism lens. In a democracy, when policy fails this spectacularly, there are mechanisms for correction: elections, a free press, public debate. In an autocracy, there is only escalation. Putin cannot admit he was wrong because his claim to power is built on the idea that he is never wrong. He is trapped in a cage of his own making, and the bars tighten every day. As the military machine grinds down and the economic lifeline frays, the pressure doesn't only build at the front. It moves toward the center. It moves toward the inner circle. In our final segment, we look at the end game. The moment elite realization of failure turns into a struggle for survival, because we've reached the point where the big reveal isn't a secret tape or a hidden document. The big reveal is the gravity of collapse itself, the realization that the Russian state, as it has existed under Vladimir Putin for 25 years, is no longer functioning as a coherent entity. It is a hollowed-out shell, held together by momentum and fear of what comes next. Consider the geopolitical humiliation now being openly discussed. Russia looking outward for labor to keep its factories running, even as its own labor market strains and shortages bite. There have been multiple reports and intelligence-linked accounts describing North Korean workers being sent to Russia to fill gaps, despite international restrictions, an image that should be unthinkable for a country that spent decades insisting it stood toe-to-toe with the United States and the European Union. This is a Russia that was supposed to be sovereign and feared now trading leverage for a few more months of endurance. But the real threat to Putin may not be Washington or Brussels. It may be the very security apparatus he built to protect himself. For years, the deal with the Russian elite, the Siloviki, was simple. You give me total loyalty, and I give you stability and wealth. That deal is dead. Stability is gone. Wealth is being liquidated, gold included, to patch budgets and prop up a system under strain. And loyalty is being tested by the reality that the man at the top has marched them into a strategic dead end. We're watching a moral vacuum open in the heart of the Kremlin. When the ideology of Greater Russia stops producing results and the economic benefits evaporate, all that is left is raw power, and raw power is a dangerous thing to clutch when everyone around you is hunting for an exit. The democracy versus authoritarianism struggle is often framed as a battle of ideas, but at its core, it's a battle of resilience. Democracies are messy and loud and divided, but they can absorb shocks because they're built, at least in theory, on the consent of the governed. Authoritarian regimes are the opposite. They look stable right up until they shatter because they are brittle. And what we're seeing in late 2025 is brittleness. Cracks not only at the edges, but in the foundation itself. Central bank gold being sold, battlefield gains measured in meters, and a state increasingly anxious about its own returning soldiers. This isn't just a military setback. This is a systemic failure of the strongman model. When you build a system where no one can tell you the truth, you eventually lose the ability to see the cliff until you've already stepped off it. The moral weight here is heavy. Nearly 1 million lives shattered to satisfy a paranoid imperial delusion, a country turned into a pariah state, a fortress that is really a prison. And here is the final reveal. The Kremlin is no longer managing a war. It is managing an eventual collapse, trying to delay the inevitable, hoping for a miracle, hoping for a change in Western leadership, hoping the world simply gets bored of the slaughter. But the world isn't getting bored. And more importantly, the Russian people, the families of the 790,000, the workers inside the cannibal economy, the veterans returning to a broken country, they aren't getting bored either. They are getting angry. The authority of Vladimir Putin is not only being tested, it is being erased. Dissolved in the acid of a war with no path to victory, a state with no path to growth, and a leadership with no path to redemption. And if the first 3 segments of this investigation have shown the rot in the foundation, the failure of the machine, and the fraying of the elite, segment 4 is the terminal paradox. The stage of a collapsing autocracy where every move the leader makes to save himself accelerates the destruction of the very system he's trying to protect. It is the moment when the strong man becomes the primary architect of his nation's liquidation. We have to talk about the internal front. While the world has been focused on HIMARS and Leopard tanks, a quieter, deadlier conflict is unfolding inside the Russian bureaucracy. We are watching what can only be described as a loyalty, tax purges, and pressure campaigns against officials, from regional governors to mid-level bureaucrats, accused of failing to meet patriotic quotas for recruitment and resource extraction. And here's the paradox. By purging technocrats, the people who keep the lights on and trains running, and replacing them with loyalists whose main qualification is the ability to parrot propaganda, Putin is breaking the gears of the state on purpose. He is choosing predictable failure over unpredictable competence. He is so afraid of a coup that he's making the country unmanageable. And look at the social contract. For 25 years, the deal was, stay out of politics and you get a semblance of middle-class life. That deal didn't merely break, it was set on fire. In 2025, Russia has moved from passive authoritarianism, where they just want you quiet, to mobilized totalitarianism, where they demand participation in destruction. Patriotic indoctrination programs have expanded aggressively through schools and youth structures, designed centrally and replicated regionally, pulling even children deeper into the system. Medusa. And surveillance has been intensifying too. Reporting and investigative work has described the growth of AI-enabled monitoring, facial recognition, camera networks, digital tools built to find the disloyal, to chill dissent, to punish disrespect with years behind bars. This is not the behavior of a regime winning hearts and minds. This is a regime that knows it has lost the argument. When you have to force people to love you under the threat of a decade in prison, you're no longer leading, you're taking hostages. Now, the strategic reveal that ties the whole investigation together. We've been tracking quiet, unannounced shifts in Russia's nuclear posture, not the loud saber rattling on state TV, but the movement, the tightening, the internal anxieties. Analysts and investigators have documented major upgrades to nuclear-related sites, hardened perimeters, expanded infrastructure, and a broader modernization effort under wartime pressure, signs of a state that sees its nuclear forces as the final guarantee when everything else becomes uncertain. And layered onto that is the fear that matters most in this moment. Not only fear of NATO, but fear of losing control from within, fear that disillusioned units, commanders facing another meat grinder assault, might see the nuclear arsenal as leverage against a central authority they believe is sacrificing them. The democracy versus authoritarianism lens matters here. In a democracy, the military is an institution bound by law. In Putin's Russia, the military is a tool of the ruler, and when the ruler fails, the tool can become a threat. The moral weight cannot be overstated. We are watching the risk of a superpower turning into something far more unstable. A state under immense strain, clinging to raw coercion, underwritten by nuclear capability. We can see the symbolism in the regime's own theater. Victory Day preparations for next year are already being discussed in a way that sounds like retreat, smaller parades, more historical equipment. Because too much of the modern kit is now twisted metal in fields outside places like Avdiivka, misspelled by some as Dvaka, but unmistakable in its grim meaning. The regime is retreating into the past because the present is too painful to acknowledge, and the future feels like it's been sold off. This is the big reveal of the entire narrative. Greatness under Putin was always a credit card purchase. They spent the capital of the future to buy a nostalgic dream of the past. And now the bill is due. The interest rates are astronomical. The creditors are at the door. And the man who signed the contract is left wondering which bodyguard is weighing the crown in his hands. So we end where we began, with that specific kind of quiet. The quiet of a vacuum. Vladimir Putin spent his career trying to make Russia respected again. Instead, he made it pitied, then feared, and now he has made it relevant only to the story of its own collapse. The moral verdict is in. A leader who fears his own people, scavenges his own economy, and relies on the charity of dictators to fight a war of choice is not a strongman. He is a historical footnote in the making. The remaining question for the rest of the world is sharp. When the monolith finally gives way to the gravity of its own failures, will we be standing close enough to be pulled down with it, or have we learned at last that the only way to deal with an autocrat is to stop believing in the mirage before he does? The clock is ticking, and in Moscow, it is later than they think. Good night.